Well, good evening. We're going to start our study right now. I know it's kind of throwing some people off. It's like, whoa, 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 Jack, don't we have to do some more singing? We will do that a little later, peeps. So right now, Brian is going to be passing out a map. Again, I know I could probably put it up there, but it's like, I'm just old school that way. I write them all, draw them all out for you and here, type stuff. So it's old school. So tonight we're going to get into Genesis chapter 14. So if you make your way there, we will begin reading in no time flat, which means later on. And so what we saw last week is that Abram was finally away from his family. He is now in a place that the Lord had called him, but he had called them back in chapter 12, verse 1, to get away from everybody. Now, I know that for many, that could be a scary place when the Lord tells you to move, when the Lord tells you to get out from a place that you're comfortable in, a place that you've been at for a long time, and he says, okay, I'm going to change things up. And it's interesting because I just heard something the other day that complacency can breed contentment for sure, but you sometimes don't grow when you're just complacent. And so he changes things up oftentimes in our lives to help us to grow. Now, I hate changes, but I know that in the Lord there's always been changes, and there always will be changes. And again, I try to slow things down, and I can't. And I'm realizing that. And so it can be a scary place to be when he calls you to change, because we do depend on one another, on family, and what is familiar. And again, he's asking him to leave everything behind. And yet when he leaves everything behind, he ends up taking with him baggage that he was not supposed to take. And again, when the Lord tells us to leave everything behind, it's almost like we get a handful and put it in our pocket to take with us, just in case we have to lean on what is familiar. And so sometimes it takes time, it takes a while to understand that trusting in what the Lord has said is truly the best thing we can ever do. But finally, the separation took place. Lot took off to the east, and you would think that because he took off to the east, that Abram would now take off to the west. And he probably was going to do that, because he says, you go to the right, I'll go to the left. You go to the left, I'll go to the right. But we're going to get along regardless. I don't need an enemy next door, is what he was kind of sharing. And so instead of taking off to the west, it almost seems like the Lord stops him before he can make a move. And he tells them, hey, look around. North, south, east, and west. It's still all yours. Even whatever Lot has taken, it's still yours. And so, again, the Lord had made the covenant, the promise with Abram, not with Lot. So we are in chapter 14. I'm going to read verses 1 through 12. Be patient with me. There's a lot of names here. And so we're going to take our time. That's why we started early. It says, now it came to pass in the days of Aramphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. But they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and Bela, that is Zor. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him attacked Rephaim in Ashtaroth, Carneum, and Zuzam in Ham, and Emem in Sheva, Kiriathim. The Horites in the mountains of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is in the wilderness, or by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpath, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, it's like right there, I read it earlier. And the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zor, went out and joined together in the battle in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arak, king of Elazar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions, and they went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Whew. I thought I'm going to take my time. I've been practicing all week, and I still mess it up. But chapter 14 of Genesis starts off by describing a typical international skirmish, if you will, a conflict, a battle, a war, if you will. In this ancient world, in which these powerful nations, they formed coalitions, confederates together. They came together and they would go to plunder and conquer and subjugate areas near the border. They were coming to take part of the land that had been promised to Abram. It kind of seems that way. Now, this is the first battle or war that is mentioned in the Bible. Now, that's not to say that it was the first war that ever happened. Again, they've been on the earth. Man has been on the earth for over 2,000 years at this point. So there has been wars, but this is the first one that's kind of really mentioned when there's not just one nation against another. It's different kings with other kings, almost like a little world war, if you will. And so, again, it's the first one that is mentioned. And for the most part, it's probably mentioned because it's going to involve Abram. And so it probably wouldn't have been mentioned if Abram had nothing to do with this, but he's going to end up in it. He's going to kind of almost be dragged in. And so the record of this battle is 4 kings against 5. That's interesting because what these 4 kings against those 5s, part of this whole thing is an outworking of God's promise to make Abram great. If you remember in chapter 12, where he says, I will bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. And so God is going to use this war to kind of prop up Abram a little bit more as the father of the nation of Israel. But again, there's going to be those whom he curses and those whom he blesses. And so it's beginning, this promise, and he hasn't even begun to have kids yet. And so this whole thing is mentioned because of that. And so when you go to verses 1 and 2, we have here, it's interesting because this skirmish that is about to take place, or that has taken place, the 5 kings that are mentioned in chapter 1, or verse 1, I mean, I passed out a little map. If you don't have a map, you can just raise your hand and somebody will get one to you. But the ones in chapter 1, or verse 1, are the ones in red. The letters in red make up those kings that are in verse 1. And it's interesting, they surround a city or area that shows up in black, and it goes by the name of Ur. So you can see Ur, like underneath all the red, you can see ER or UR, which is really interesting because that sounds so familiar to us. You see, this is where Lot and Abram both come from. So in other words, they originated from that place. So these are his peeps. These are his people, basically, that have made their way over to where he is at right now, or where Lot is at. Now, it's interesting because if you look on your map, they could have just easily gone west. But they're going to go northwest, and then they'll start making a turn up by Syria to start coming down. Because when you look at them just going straight west, that is what we call, what is mostly Saudi Arabia, and it's all desert. It was desert back then, it's desert today. If you went on your Google map and you went to the satellite, it's like there's some cities there, but back then it was just plain. And so they would always follow the water sources for the most part, which would be the Euphrates River, and then they would head on down. And so that's what they're going to do. But it was interesting to me that that is where these people are from. That's where these 5 kings are from. And the king of Elam, who is Kedorlaomer, more than likely he is the leader of this whole coalition because he is the one that's mentioned more times than the others. Now, I wish they had easier names, but the hardest name is the one that's mentioned the most. So if I don't keep on mentioning him, maybe I'll just call him Omer for the remainder of the time, but I've been practicing, so hopefully it sticks in my head. But for the most part, he is probably the leader, even though he is not mentioned first in verse 1. He will be mentioned first later on, but he will be mentioned quite a few times because he is the one that seems to be the one that rallied everybody together to go and take care of this situation. Now, there is another king that is mentioned at the end of verse 1. And he goes by the name of Tidal, or Tidal. And he is the king of nations. The word nations there, because again, you're going, whoa, man, this guy must have a lot of nations. And yet, when you look in the map, it's like, where is he at? Well, Tidal goes by the name of Goyim, and sometimes it's spelled Goyim or Goiim. And he kind of is right in the middle there of Elam and the other places there. Or no, they have the 5 nations. Sorry about that. And so he is part of that. And that word Goyim means heathen. So he's the king of heathens, or it could also mean Gentiles, but it's also rendered nations, but it's only rendered nations in the Old King James and the New King James. If you have a different translation, it says Goyim. And so mostly and so I don't quite get it, but he is the king of nations, which again goes back to he's the king of just heathens. And it says that they made war with these other guys, Bera, Bisham, Bersha, and Shibnah, and Shemeber. Now, those 5 kings, because there's the other king, the king of Bela, but those 5 kings, they are in the green letters in your map. And you can see that they are kind of around where the Dead Sea would be at. And so that is where the plain of Jordan is at. That is what Lot chose. That's where Lot is now from. And so 4 of the 5 kings are named, except for the king of Bela, which is Zor. Now, perhaps Zor could be his name, if the way you might want to read it, but we also know that Zor is a place. And so it sounds more like Bela would become the place called Zor later on. Now, it would seem that going from going all the way northwest and then coming down to the plain of Jordan, and they would probably be coming down on the east side of the Jordan River, because there's a road that comes from the south of Israel area going all the way north, and it's called the King's Highway. And you see that a few times in the scriptures. And that would be the trade route that they would all be taken. So they're coming down from the north, coming down to the plain of Jordan. Now, one would think that coming all that way just to go do some battle or war would be foolish. It's like, why do you have to go all that way? Now, I don't think that they were just coming because they were interested in the land. It says that, or to conquer land, it says in verse 3 that they all joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. So we're told that the kings came to this valley. Now, the fact that there is a parenthesis next to Siddim that says that is the Salt Sea means that eventually that place would become the Salt Sea, or what we know as more as the Dead Sea. And I was sharing with you last week that Lot, when he looked at that plain in Jordan, it was well watered. There was greenery. There was a lot that he could profit from, and that's why he chose that area. But it would be after Sodom and Gomorrah that area, that whole area, would become one of the deepest places on the earth, to where it's anywhere from about 1,200 to 1,400 feet below sea level. So when God annihilated that place, it went down deep. And because the sea wasn't really, there might have been a lake there, but it used to come all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba. So it's interesting that, again, that's where the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea would be located. But this is the reason why they're coming to war, because it tells us in verse 4, 12 years they serve Omar. So these kings from this area of the plain of Jordan, they served this guy. For 12 years, they had served there. Now, we don't know if Lot has been there for 12 years yet. But he's been there for a little time now. But they have been serving these 5 kings had been serving these 4 kings for that long. In what way they served, we don't know exactly how they served them. But these 5 kings decided, enough. We're not going to serve them anymore. And so for 12 years they did. On the 13th year, they didn't. And so you can imagine in that 13th year, or Omer is thinking, what the heck? How come they're not coming? How come they're not sending us whatever we needed? Why are they not serving us? So it takes about a year for them to understand that these guys are rebelling. That's what's going on. And so it's not until the 14th year that they decide, well, we're going to go put them in check. We're going to put them back in line because we want these guys to continue to serve us in whatever capacity they were going to serve these guys. And so they were going to go down. And it says that in the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, the rest of the guys, they came and they began attacking these people. Now, these people that they're going to be attacking, their cities are named are in white in our map. So you could see as they're coming down, they're going to start hitting each one of these cities. And it's almost like they passed the plane of where they're going to eventually come. They're going to come all the way down south, just to the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is El Paran. And from there, they're going to go back north, and they're going to hit these places. And so it seems like their strategy is, as they're attacking along the way, they're going to make this circle and come back up to the valley of Siddim. And so verse 8, it says that the king of Sodom, Gomorrah, Amah, and Zeboim, and Bela, they thought, well, it's time to go fight these guys. Now you would think, you would like to think that 5 kings would be able to defeat four kings, wouldn't you? It depends. It depends how big the 4 kings' army is compared to these guys, even though they have 5 kings. But you would think that they would have the advantage anyways because they're going to be fighting on their own turf. These guys have traveled hundreds of miles to come over here, and they're fighting these 5 kings on their turf. Now, another thing, apparently, these 5 kings didn't even know their own land. Because it tells us that they began to, it was filled with asphalt pits, and some of them fell into those pits. They got bogged down. It's like you would think if that is your area and you want to protect your area, that you would use those pits for your advantage. Maybe set up some traps. Maybe do something, but they didn't do any of those things. Instead, the only thing that they could do, because they were being beaten and overtaken, the only thing they could do was flee into the mountains, into the hills. Now, what is interesting, because Ezekiel chapter 16 tells us that the lifestyle of these people of Sodom and Gomorrah really didn't prepare them for conflict. They seem to be more about pleasure. And we know from the story that it's more about debauchery that's going on in their lives. But they didn't prepare for war, really. They had kings. They seemed to have some kind of an army, but they really weren't prepared for conflict, because Ezekiel 16, 49 and 50 says this: "Look, this is the iniquity of your sister Sodom. Her and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." Verse 50. "And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore, I took them away as I saw fit." If you're not going to be protecting your land, if you're not going to be using the things that can benefit you, like these asphalt pits, then whoever comes and attacks you doesn't even have to work that hard. If your life is all about pleasure and now reality sets in and now there's conflict coming in, you're not prepared for anything. Now, again, I'm not saying that we should be doomsdayers, although in the world we're living in. But it's interesting because there's so many people, and Christians included, man. It's all about our next fun outing. It's about pleasure. It's about all these experiences that we can have, and there's nothing bad for them. But when a crisis hits, what happens? Have you even prepared yourself to at least stand up to some of the trials and tribulations and maybe even some attacks that might come your way? Or is that all about pleasure? Because these guys didn't prepare themselves for anything hard that would come their way. All they thought about was the pleasures of this world. Which brought me back to some verses that I shared with you last week, where it says in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, it says, "Do not love the world, nor the things of the world, in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever." Again, we have such a great opportunity to live in the world, but we don't have to be of the world. It's not saying that we can't go and enjoy the things that bring us pleasure. But when that is our sole focus, when we take our eyes off of the things that are important truly in our lives, that are serious. Again, we have a saying, we'll have fun when it's time to have fun, but we'll be serious when it's time to be serious. And our lives should be serious to an extent that everything revolves around who God is and what He says in His Word. And again, man, we see Abram, and he is a very wealthy man. And there's a lot that he has. But he took things serious when he needed to take things serious. Whereas, again, we see that these from Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding areas, including Lot, it was all about pleasure. It was all about the things that they wanted to do to make them happy instead of being holy. And it says in verse 11 and 12, "Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions, and they went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." So, whatever purpose the kings had, or may have had, in this war, whatever their purpose was, because they were going to get these guys back in line, put them back in check. They were supposed to be their servants, however they served them. However the Lord used that to get them this way, God had some other plans in store. God had something special in mind for Lot. You see, Lot had become a prisoner of war at this point. Lot had, last week when we looked at Lot, he looked at Sodom, and then he got closer to Sodom, and then he pitched his tent in Sodom. He looked, he moved, and then he lived in Sodom and became part of it. Now again, what we need to remember about Lot is that he is called a righteous man several times, at least 3 times in 1st or 2nd Peter chapter 2. But you really couldn't tell by the way he conducted himself. But it just kind of goes to show you that you can be a believer, love the Lord, and yet live so close to the world that you become a prisoner of it. That was his heart. I shared with you last week that when they went down to Egypt, and the Egypt is always a form of the world. Abram went, he connived, he schemed, he did whatever he had to do for his own life. But he takes his nephew with him. And it almost seems like it's after that time that Lot got exposed to that world, to that kind of a world, that he kind of liked it. Oh, he was a believer, although we never see that he built an altar. He had tents, but we never see him worship. But he hung out with his uncle, so he knew what godliness and righteousness looked like. And yet he's considered righteous in the New Testament. But yet, he got so close to the world that he thought, I kind of really like the pleasures that come from it. He saw his uncle's life, and yet he kind of liked the things of the world. He kind of tried to play both sides almost, but he didn't really do a good side on the righteous side. He's just kind of like, oh, I'll step more on this side of the fence in the world than I am on this side of the fence. And again, when people try to play the fence, it's like, again, you can't sit on the fence because Satan owns the fence too. Abraham, we know, is called the friend of God. But it seemed like Lot became a friend of the world. And in time, Lot was conformed to the things of the world. Again, he's still going to be called righteous Lot later on. And again, I don't know how your life goes, but man, there's things that man, we are so close to the world that we need to be really careful because it will suck us in and it will chew us out. It will chew us up and spit us out, I mean. And that's exactly what we see happening to Lot because he got so close to the world that he became in bondage to it, that he became a prisoner of it. And he could not tell people, okay, I'm done. I want to walk with God. Oh, I'm sorry. You're a prisoner now. We're taking you where you don't want to go. Because that's what ends up with sin. You end up going to places that you never thought you'd be. I'm sure he never thought he would be a prisoner of war. That he would end up in that place. And again, I think it's a warning for us that when we see a man like Lot, that again, he's considered righteous. He has great examples around him. He might have gone to the altar with his uncle, but he never even built an altar for himself or for his family. And we see that the world chews him up and spits him out because that's what the world does. And I think that as believers, most of us who have been in the world and been saved from the world, when we think of going back to the world to see if the world is still the same as it was when we were there, guess what? It has not changed. It has not changed in thousands of years. We see stories like that, it's like this, and it's like, no, peeps, it's the same. Well, maybe it'll be different. It won't be different. I think we know a lot of Christians, and maybe you've been one, that tried to play both sides. And you become so caught up in the things that there's no joy left in your life because you know enough about Jesus that you can't be joyful, but not enough to have the joy. You don't have enough of him. And so Lot's capture, I believe, is a good way of how God disciplines those whom he loves. And it reminded him probably, I hope it did, that he had no business living in Sodom. Now, I have no doubt that Abraham, his uncle, had been praying for him throughout this whole time that he was over there. Probably understanding what Sodom and Gomorrah was all about. And now that he is in it, maybe he prayed, Lord, bring him back to a place where he's just a stranger and a pilgrim instead of settling down. Instead of building a foundation for his house, that he would continue to be in tents, that you pick up and you continue to move. But God disciplines his children because he loves his children. And he wants the best for them, even if he has to allow the world to take you captive, to ruin your life even. As it says in Proverbs 3 and Hebrews, I'll paraphrase it, the Lord chastens those whom he loves. He loves you enough to do that, to allow you to go and hit rock bottom. If we don't listen to his rebuke, then again, he'll get our attention one way or another. And I've said this often, either humble yourself or get humbled. You either stand on the rock or you'll be crushed by the rock. But the rock will win every time. And oftentimes when we end up having to be humbled, gosh, it's kind of painful. And it's unnecessary. I shared with you guys last week that Lot should have told his uncle, no, I'm not going to make the decision. You tell me where you want me to go. Lot or Abram should have just sent him back to Ur and go, you don't belong here no more, bro. Go all the way home. But he didn't. He let him choose. And he took advantage of that. And so it says in verse 13 to verse 16, then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth tree in Mamre, the Amorites, brother of Ashcol, and brother of Anar. And they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and they went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Horba, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. What I find interesting here is that that one guy who escapes, he knew exactly where to go and who to go look for. And I think that's a testament once again to Abram and who he is and the character that he has. Because he is consistent in what he has been doing throughout his life, as far as we've already seen in the last couple of chapters. That when this guy, who is probably part of, maybe, possibly a servant of Lot, or maybe one of the soldiers who escaped, they knew about the servant of God, the one that they could go to. And I don't know if you've ever been in situations when you're walking close to the Lord and people know you and they might make fun of you, but when things are hurting, when they're hurting, they know who to go to, or they should know who to go to. They should be going to you because of your consistency and the way you conduct yourself. They should be able to trust you and come and tell you, it's like, hey man, I'm going through a hard time right now. I don't want to tell my other friends because they'll make fun of me the whole time. So they go to people whom they can trust. And I love that about what we see here. That the guy escapes. He doesn't go and hide. He knows exactly where to go. He needs to go find Abram. Now, I don't know if he knew that Abram would go and fight their cause or not. I don't know that. But possibly, he knew that Abram served the living God. And perhaps his God can intervene and do something. Maybe he's heard about that. But it tells us that he escaped and he went and he told Abram the Hebrew. This is the first time that we hear the word Hebrew in the Bible. And I've shared this before, that most believe that it comes from his great, 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 great grandfather, Eber, which interestingly enough is still alive at this time. Eber is still alive when his great-great-great-grandson is called the Hebrew. What I found even more interesting is it's quite possible that Eber still lives in Ur of the Chaldeans, where these four kings have come from. It's quite possible. Now, what I found fascinating is they're headed back to that area. Lot is with them. Maybe God is saying, Lot, I'm going to take you back to Ur and get you away from the world. What is interesting is that they go to Abram. He dwells by the terebinth tree. And we learned last week that was down and he dwelt in Hebron. Now, the cities that Abram will go to in your map here, they're all in black. Those are the ones that he is in because he is in Hebron. Hebron was about 20 miles south of Jerusalem, where you see Salem there. And he's about 25 to 30 miles from Bethel when he first came and built the altar. But it tells us that when they come to him, that Abram has allies with him. He has built allies with the people. And even though we know that Abram is separated from the world, he is not isolated from the world. And I think this is a good example here that he has allies that are not believers, but he can do work with them. So much so that when someone is in trouble, he goes to them and says, hey, we need to rally around and go save these people. And so he is separate from the world, but not isolated. And he joins forces with them, or they join forces with him, to go and take care of the situation that was brought before him. Now, Abram could have easily said, hey, I'm sorry, man. Lot, he chose this life and he chose this lifestyle. He's made his bed, now let him live in it or lay in it, or however the saying goes. But he could have easily done that. And I think oftentimes we as Christians, when we know of someone who has gone off the deep end, we don't lift a finger sometimes to go and help them when they're in trouble. And we just say, you chose that. You didn't have to go do that. And again, we're seeing the character of Abram here, who is willing to work with non-believers to go and help the situation that he really doesn't need to get involved in. It's possible that once they separated, he thought, okay, it ends here. But that's not the case. He has to go save his nephew. And it won't end here either. We see that he will once again intercede for his nephew. But it says that he arms 318 of his trained servants. Now, this kind of shows us that Abram, that guy was pretty wealthy. To have 318 trained servants that he could assemble in a heartbeat when he needed it. Abram was a man who walked by faith, and yet he was a very prudent man because he had his own personal army. He trusted in the Lord, but he kept his gunpowder dry too. He knew it was like, yeah, I'm going to trust the Lord, but I will use wisdom that if we ever need to fight, we will fight in the physical realm. And so he kept them trained, ready to defend his interests. And so this army, again, along with the coalition that he gathers together, They go and pursue after these guys, and it says that they go from Hebron, basically, all the way up to Dan. And Dan would be the northernmost part of Israel today. I remember years ago when I was able to go there, we went to Dan, and there's this gate that they believe that is, I think they call it the Abraham Gate. That is like one of the oldest structures that they have found that dates back to the time when they came down from Ur area. Possibly. But it's at the northern part, and they're going to travel a long distance to go north. And so they go as far as Dan, and then it says that once they get to Dan, he ends up dividing the forces to go fight by night. And you're wondering, it's like, when did Abram become a general? Right. When did he like start strategizing how he's going to like take over the world if he had to and go fight these things? But that's who this man is. But he goes and he seizes these people, and they go north of Damascus. Now you're talking a couple hundred miles that they have traveled to go take care of the situation. They go all the way to Horba, which is north of Damascus in Syria. And they go all the way up there, and it says that they bring back all the goods, and he brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Unfortunately, Lot moved back to where he had been before. Maybe you would have thought that he says, hey, I think I'm done with the world. Can I come back? And maybe Abram would have said, no, maybe you should go back to Ur. Again, I was conflicted here going, maybe you shouldn't have went and saved him. Maybe they could have taken him all the way back to Ur, to his great-great-great-great-grandfather. But he didn't. And he would eventually lose everything when Sodom and Gomorrah is judged. Because that's what happens when you go back into the world. He had every opportunity, but he went back. And so let's finish reading the chapter here. The king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is, the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, for he was the priest of Most High God, or the God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And he blessed God Most High, who delivered, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. And he gave him a tithe of all. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the people and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing, from a thread to a sandal strap, that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their possessions. It seems interesting that after this amazing victory, it seems like Abram is faced with a new battle. You see, sometimes when we face the greatest dangers in our lives is when we've come through a great victory. And we see examples of that when the children of Israel take Jericho, and then they, in their own confidence, they get defeated by Ai. Or when Elijah has a great victory in Mount Carmel with all the priests, and then some woman threatens his life, and he runs for 3 months and 300 miles. And he panics. As one commentator said about this Scottish pastor, Andrew Bonar, he says, it says, let us be watchful after the victory as before the battle. In other words, we need to always be on our guard, always. You see, when he returns from the battle, he's met by 2 different kings. The guy from Sodom and Melchizedek. Now, it's interesting because Melchizedek is not only a king, but he's also a priest, which normally didn't happen. And there's so much that we can say about Melchizedek because he is a type of Christ. If you read in Hebrews, man, oh man, the study that years ago we did in Hebrews, he is just a fascinating man. Because it says that he had no beginning or no end. Nobody knows where he comes from. Oh, there's speculations, but this guy, again, this other guy finally just says, hey, give me all the people, you can keep the stuff. I want the people. Why? Because he used the people for his pleasures. He says, just take what you want. Whereas Melchizedek, he comes and he brings them bread and wine. And I love the fact that, again, here you have Abram coming to Melchizedek. Melchizedek blesses him. The other guy's trying to bribe him. Take whatever you want. And he's going, nah, I never want you to come back and say you owe me. Melchizedek is not saying anything like that. He says, here, let me give you bread and wine. And what does he do? He gives him a tithe of everything, which, again, is another type of this priest that receives tithe before any law, before anything, before the priesthood is ever set up. You have Melchizedek. And so we have this beautiful picture here of Abram understanding, man, there's a tug of war here between good and evil. I could be bribed over here and have some satisfaction, or I can go and give of myself and all that I have to the Lord. And man, I'm sure this is tempting at times for us, because the world is always calling. It always wants to give us the niceties of what could be out there for us. And yet it's important for us to understand that when the world is tempting you, is bribing you, that we need to be careful. The Lord, all he says is like, here, I'll give you the bread and the wine, which represents the sacrifice of our Lord. And that's why tonight I wanted to have communion with you guys. We wanted to be able to just have some worship at the end. We're going to pass out communion. It's interesting because Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And he is from Salem, which means peace. And so he is the king of righteousness. He is a king of peace. And so what he gives to Abram here, it's almost like, and again, you almost want to correlate it with the death of Christ, but is it possible, could it be that the way he presents it to him, this is a sacrifice of the victory that we will one day have when we are redeemed, when it all comes together and we get to rejoice with him forever. And so it seems like Melchizedek blesses him, but man, on the flip side, Abram wants to bless him with his offerings. And as much as Melchizedek gives him, he wants to give back. And shouldn't that be our relationship as the Lord has given to us, that we would just want to give him our everything? Now, Abram had every right to take all the possessions. He went and fought for this guy. He saved this guy. He saved his people. But he didn't want to be indebted to anybody, only the Lord. And so he decided that that's what we're going to do. You can keep whatever. Whatever these guys have used up, that's good. And these other guys who again, they were his allies, let them take their portion. But as for me, I'm going to serve the Lord. And I'm going to bow down before my God. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. So I'm going to ask Thomas to come on up. And we're going to pass out the elements. And Kevin, would you help me out with that?